Picture this. For decades, a particular nation possessed a secret weapon. It was not a missile, nor was it a nuclear centrifuge. It was something far quieter, far more powerful, and far more essential to its survival. It was a city, a gleaming, gold-drenched, tax-free metropolis sitting just across the water. And that city kept the nation breathing year after year, even as the rest of the world tried to suffocate it. But in a single catastrophic miscalculation, that nation turned on its benefactor. It launched hundreds of missiles and thousands of drones at the very place that had been its economic oxygen for nearly half a century. And now, that city is hitting back not with weapons, but with something far more feared: financial annihilation. Today, we are going to break down the full story of how this partnership was forged, how it was destroyed in a matter of weeks, and why the consequences of that decision could accelerate the final collapse of a regime. This is one of the most remarkable stories of self-destruction in modern geopolitical history, and it is unfolding right now. Let us start at the beginning, because to understand what is breaking down currently, you first have to appreciate how this relationship was built, and how extraordinarily intricate it really was. Ever since the United States imposed its first wave of sanctions in 1979, the nation in question found itself progressively cut off from the global financial system. Things tightened even further in the mid-2000s when new pressure over its nuclear program began targeting its banks and its oil revenues directly. On paper, that pressure should have brought the economy to its knees within years, maybe even within months, but it did not. The reason was simple. The city across the Gulf stepped in. Right across the water, just a short boat ride from the coastline, sat one of the most open, flexible, and commercially imaginative cities on Earth. It offered open ports, a massive free trade zone, a labyrinth of shell companies, and a banking environment that was, let us say, willing to look the other way when paperwork got creative. By 2010, more than 8,000 companies owned by nationals of that targeted country were operating out of the city's free zones. Annual bilateral trade boomed, reaching somewhere between $16 and $28 billion at its peak. On top of that, non-oil exports alone were running at roughly $6 to $7 billion annually, flowing through these same networks. A former official from the United States Treasury Department once described this city as, and I am quoting here, the most important hub in the entire sanctions evasion network. Think about that for a second. America's own financial enforcers were openly acknowledging that a close Gulf partner had become the central artery for the very country it was trying to strangle economically. That statement alone tells you everything about how critical this relationship had become. Now let us talk about how the system actually worked in practice, because this was not some shadowy back alley operation. It was an industrial-scale, highly efficient machine operating in broad daylight. Oil tankers from a massive shadow fleet would anchor offshore in international waters. Under cover of night, crews would transfer cargo to vessels carrying cleaner documentation, ships that claimed their cargo had originated from a neutral third country. These vessels would then sail directly into one of the world's busiest ports, right in the heart of the city. Handlers would log the shipments as routine commercial imports. From there, the oil was either refined locally or sold on the open market, and the proceeds cycled back through layers of locally registered accounts. It was clean, fast, and efficient. The flow went the other way too. Electronics, car parts, medical equipment, goods that were desperately needed to keep factories and hospitals running, were shipped into the city, labeled as destined for local businesses, then quietly re-exported across the border. The whole mechanism relied on three things: proximity, speed, and a city that had built its entire identity around being the region's ultimate middleman. But here's where it gets even deeper. The relationship was never just about goods and oil. It was human. It was woven into the very fabric of the city itself. Families did not just pass through. They settled. They bought property, opened restaurants, ran shipping firms, enrolled their children in local schools, and built entire communities. By the early 2000s, estimates placed the diaspora population in the city at somewhere between 150,000 and 300,000 people strong. They were embedded in gold trading, textiles, construction, and maritime commerce. Every school fee, every business contract, every paycheck sent home was a thread in a vast financial web. The country under sanctions had not invented this mechanism, but it had mastered it. It turned this city into the most efficient offshore financial lifeline in the entire region. And that efficiency had enormous consequences for the global sanctions regime, because sanctions really only work when the flow of money and goods is genuinely cut off. Once those channels remain open, the pressure never fully lands. A senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, who previously served as a senior sanctions strategist, put it bluntly. He stated that this city was the single most critical jurisdiction in the regime's sanctions evasion architecture, not one of many important hubs, the single most critical one. Full stop. Without that connection, factories would have slowed within weeks, not years, and then stopped entirely as spare parts disappeared. Hospitals would have faced supply shortages within months, and the funding pipelines running to proxy forces across the region would have tightened significantly, cutting into the ability to project power far beyond its own borders. But that is not what happened, because the city stayed open. And because of that, the nation under pressure was given something that economists and strategists almost universally agree was the deciding factor: room to breathe. And in a system under that kind of sustained pressure, the distance between breathing and suffocating is everything. And then 2026 arrived, and it changed everything. On February 28th, a joint military operation launched coordinated airstrikes targeting military leadership and key infrastructure. The nation retaliated hard, firing ballistic missiles and drones across the region. But here's what stunned analysts, strategists, and even many of its own former allies. A massive portion of that retaliation was aimed directly at the very country that had quietly kept it alive for decades. According to official Defense Ministry reports from the targeted city-state, as of April 1st, a total of 438 ballistic missiles, 2,012 drones, and 19 cruise missiles had been fired at targets inside the nation's territory alone. That is a staggering number. In just the opening wave that began on February 28th, the city-state reportedly absorbed around 63% of the initial barrage. Airports, seaports, oil terminals, energy infrastructure, all of it was in the crosshairs simultaneously. As Fortune reported, the global port operator was forced to suspend operations at the largest container port in the Middle East, a facility that accounts for 36% of the entire city's gross domestic product, after a berth caught fire following debris from an intercepted missile. The international airport was struck multiple times over the course of several weeks, causing temporary flight suspensions and widespread airspace closures. A drone strike impacted a major bunkering port, triggering fires and halting oil loading operations. A fire at a massive industrial complex forced the national oil company to shut down its flagship refinery, a facility that would otherwise produce 922,000 barrels of oil per day. And on April 2nd, the military arm of the aggressor announced it had deliberately targeted a major American technology company's data center in the city. As Al Jazeera reported, stock markets in the city lost over $120 billion in value since the conflict began. The main benchmark index dropped roughly 16%, and the neighboring market declined about 9%. Beyond the markets, the human cost was real. At least 12 civilians were killed. Around 190 people were injured. The chief executive of the national energy firm described what was happening as nothing less than, in his words, global economic warfare. The foreign minister was direct, stating publicly that the nation would not be blackmailed by terrorists. Here's where it becomes a turning point. Because the aggressor had committed something beyond a military miscalculation. It had committed a profound act of strategic self-destruction. It had struck the one country in the world that was still actively helping it survive. An analyst from the group United Against Nuclear Iran noted that this was going to be a real problem because the city had been an economic lung for the regime. That is economic pressure and diplomatic isolation in a way that the city-state is able to employ, and it will have a very considerable impact. The aggressor assumed that business would outlast politics, that the merchants, bankers, and free zone operators would quietly absorb whatever happened diplomatically or militarily because the money was too good to walk away from. That assumption turned out to be fatally wrong. The regime did not just cross a red line, it torched the one bridge it still desperately needed. And so the city-state responded not with missiles, but with money, or rather, by taking money away. The counterstrike began quietly in early March, but once it started, it moved fast and it moved hard. Reports confirmed that billions of dollars in linked assets were being frozen inside local banks. These were not dormant private savings accounts. These were regime-linked funds, shell companies masking illicit oil trades, hidden reserves that had been quietly sustaining operational networks for years. When those accounts were locked, it was not just money being held, it was oxygen being cut off. As the Wall Street Journal reported, authorities began examining a range of countermeasures, including targeted asset freezes of locally based shell companies and a sweeping financial crackdown on the local currency exchange houses that sit at the center of the financial plumbing. According to Iran International, security teams arrested dozens of money changers tied directly to the military and intelligence networks of the aggressor. These were not random low-level operators. These were trusted, long-established figures who had spent years quietly converting shadow oil revenues into dollars and other hard currencies, money that flowed directly back to fund military and proxy operations. The analyst from United Against Nuclear Iran noted that the detention of these trusted money changers threatens networks that took years to build. The crackdown then moved into the business layer. Companies linked to these networks were shuttered, often without warning. Visas were revoked, including coveted long-term golden visas that had allowed wealthy individuals to live and operate freely in the Emirates. Visa renewals stopped. Some business people found themselves stranded outside the country. Others scrambled to relocate operations to other cities, far from the now hostile environment. And the institutional closures sent the clearest signal of all. The community hospital, which had served the diaspora since the 1970s, was ordered shut in mid-March, including its emergency wing. Several community schools were closed. Community centers and cultural spaces that had been the social glue of the diaspora for decades were sealed off. These were not quiet administrative decisions. They were deliberate, visible, and deeply symbolic. Think about what each of these moves means in practical terms. Frozen assets mean cash cannot flow. Shuttered exchange houses mean currency conversions stall. Closed companies mean fewer routes for trade. Revoked visas mean fewer operators available to keep the system running. Close the schools and the hospitals, and you tell the community itself that it is no longer welcome here. Each move did not just add pressure, it multiplied pressure. And when all of it happens simultaneously, something else kicks in: uncertainty. Even the parts of the system that technically remained open no longer felt stable. Every shipment attracted extra scrutiny. Every transaction took longer. Compliance costs rose. Insurance costs rose. And that friction, accumulated over weeks and months, becomes almost as damaging as a direct shutdown. What made all of this even more devastating for the aggressor is the same thing that had made the city so attractive to begin with: proximity. The closeness was once a massive advantage. Fast transit times, easy logistics, trusted relationships built over decades. But once the system tightened, that same proximity became a liability. Ships had to reroute, burning more fuel and adding days to delivery windows. New company registrations suddenly attracted intense scrutiny. Front operations that had blended seamlessly into the commercial landscape suddenly stood out. The machine that had run smoothly for 30 years started grinding, and you can see the impact inside the nation in real time. The currency, already weakened by years of sanctions and mismanagement, is now trading at roughly 1,470,000 to the dollar on the parallel market, the weakest level ever recorded in history. The National Statistical Center reported that year-on-year inflation climbed to 71.8% by March 2026, up from above 42% at the end of 2025. Annual inflation for the 12-month period ending March stood at 50.6%. That does not just sit on paper. It shows up in every market, every shop, every household. Bread prices have climbed another 18%. Rice is up 12% in the first quarter alone. Medicines and spare parts that once flowed reliably through the city's channels are beginning to disappear from shelves. Production is slowing as supply chains fracture. Now here is a critical question. Why would a country attack the very city that was keeping it economically alive? The answer lies in how the regime had come to see its neighbor over the years, leading up to 2026. The city-state had steadily built closer ties with Washington militarily, economically, and strategically. It had deepened its quiet but clear relationship with Israel, particularly following the Abraham Accords of 2020. From the regime's perspective, the city stopped being neutral ground. It started looking like an extension of a growing coalition working directly against its interests. Every defense deal signed with Abu Dhabi reinforced that perception. Every joint military exercise, every sign of intelligence sharing, every economic deepening with Israel made it stronger. So in the regime's strategic calculus, striking the neighbor was not purely retaliation. It was a message to every state that had chosen alignment with America and Israel over neutrality. No matter who backs you, you are not untouchable. The regime also had a secondary objective. The city had spent decades building its image as an absolutely safe, absolutely stable global hub for trade, investment, and tourism. Shaking that image, hitting the airport, the ports, the financial district, was meant to trigger investor flight. Make the city feel dangerous, and you undermine its economic model. The strikes were economic pressure delivered through military means. But here is where the calculation fell apart completely. The regime underestimated how much it still needed the city, and it overestimated how much the city-state would absorb before responding. In trying to send a warning to the world, the regime effectively torched its own lifeline. That is not strategy, that is desperation. And the consequences are now rippling far beyond national borders and financial markets. Because what happens in the Strait of Hormuz does not stay in the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most strategically critical choke points on the entire planet. Nearly 20% of the world's total oil supply passes through this narrow passage. When the aggressor moved to disrupt or threaten shipping through the strait, the effects were global and immediate. Tankers began rerouting around Africa, adding 2 to 3 weeks to delivery schedules and burning millions of additional dollars in fuel costs. According to multiple shipping industry reports, insurance premiums for vessels transiting the Gulf surged by 300%, with some carriers paying millions just to secure coverage for a single passage. Naval forces from allied nations deployed carriers and destroyers to conduct patrols and mine-clearing operations to keep the lanes partially open. Oil prices spiked above $110 per barrel, hitting consumers across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Shipping companies reported voyage delays of 10 to 14 days on rerouted journeys. The head of the International Energy Agency described the overall situation as, in their words, the greatest global energy security challenge in history. As Fortune reported, a former chief strategist for a major investment bank warned that what was happening to the city-state could be catastrophic for global markets unless the aggressor was decisively deterred. Global stock markets felt the shock. The Dow Jones fell over 400 points. The S&P 500 dropped around 7% over the same period. European and Asian indexes fell 1 to 2%. Emerging markets were broadly hurt. The ripple effects of this confrontation are showing up in everyday life across 4 continents. And the city-state is not standing still in the face of all this. Despite absorbing the economic and human cost of the conflict, officials are pivoting decisively. The country's sovereign wealth funds, which exceed $2 trillion, give it the financial firepower to absorb short-term damage while pressing long-term strategic interests. The nation is now actively involved in international efforts to keep the Strait of Hormuz open, including mine-clearing operations and naval escort coordination. It is pushing at the United Nations level for a Chapter 7 resolution that could authorize international force to defend the shipping lanes. A senior presidential advisor stated publicly that the conflict needs to end with a long-term solution for Gulf security, explicitly discouraging a ceasefire that does not accomplish durable stability. On March 26th, the city-state joined other regional powers in a joint condemnation of the aggressor and its affiliated armed groups, specifically calling out the attacks against regional countries and their civilian infrastructure. The ambassador to the United States argued in a Wall Street Journal piece that the 2026 conflict was proof that the model of regional destabilization through proxy warfare was unsustainable. This is a country that built its identity on trade, not patrols, on commerce, not condemnation. And yet here it is on the front lines of a security confrontation it never chose. A professor from the American University in Dubai told Al Jazeera that while the market collapse was a serious setback for investor sentiment, it should be viewed as a temporary shock rather than evidence of structural economic damage. International financial centers are judged not only by market performance during crisis, he said, but also by the quality of regulation, liquidity management, institutional resilience, and operational continuity. The city-state, in other words, is signaling that it intends to come through this stronger, not weaker. And while the macro picture is important, we cannot overlook the human dimension because the deepest cuts in this story are not being felt on trading floors. They are being felt by ordinary families. These people had not just built a business presence in the city, they had built a home there, a second homeland. Families whose grandparents had settled in the city, who had raised their children there, who had built institutions that served as the social backbone of a community of hundreds of thousands. And all of that is now unraveling. Parents are scrambling to find new schools after community institutions were shut. Patients who depended on the community hospital, which served the diaspora since the 1970s, are searching for alternative care, including emergency services. Business owners who once operated seamlessly in free zones now face constant audits, delays, and rising uncertainty. Some have been forced to split operations across multiple cities just to stay functional. Informal trade networks that kept small-scale commerce flowing have gone quiet. And that silence says everything. What is really breaking here, beneath the frozen assets and the shuttered offices and the revoked visas, is trust. Relationships built over generations are fracturing in a matter of months. Some residents have chosen to leave altogether. Others remain, but in an environment they no longer recognize. The city that once felt like an extension of home now feels foreign, even hostile. And the city-state is making a clear statement to the world by doing this. It is telling investors in London, Singapore, and New York that it will defend stability, not ignore threats. It is telling its neighbors across the Gulf that even the most pragmatic, commercially oriented state has limits. And it is telling the regime directly that the era of quiet accommodation is over. As the senior fellow from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies noted, the crackdown is landing in a way that goes far beyond what distant Western sanctions have ever managed to achieve, precisely because it hits the core of how the nation has actually been keeping itself afloat day to day. Not through some abstract mechanism, but through specific people, specific companies, specific channels, all of which are now being methodically dismantled. Let us bring this home. Let us talk about where all of this leads. The nation is now navigating the most severe economic pressure it has ever faced. Its currency is at a historic low. Its inflation is running above 70% year over year. Its primary sanctions evasion network is being dismantled in real time. Its oil revenues are under attack both from Western sanctions and from disrupted shipping routes. Its proxy funding pipelines are feeling the squeeze. And its relationship with the one city in the world that had kept all of this survivable is now broken. Not strained, broken, because the regime itself chose to break it. That combination of pressures does not build towards stability. It builds towards a breaking point. Society was already under severe stress before the 2026 conflict began. The protest movement had already shaken the regime internally. The economic deterioration had already pushed inflation past 42% before the first missile was fired. Add 71.8% annual inflation, a collapsing currency, crumbling supply chains, and the loss of what experts call the single most critical jurisdiction in the sanctions evasion architecture, and the picture becomes stark. At the same time, the city-state, despite its own economic wounds, is positioned to recover. Tourism revenue, which accounted for roughly $70 billion and 13% of gross domestic product, will return once stability is restored. Property markets will stabilize. Investor confidence, shaken but not destroyed, will rebuild. The city-state has the financial reserves, the institutional resilience, and the global relationships to absorb a temporary shock and emerge with its model intact. The aggressor, by contrast, has burned precisely the mechanism that was making its own shock survivable. For decades, analysts debated whether Western sanctions alone could ever truly break the regime. The city loophole was one of the most compelling arguments that they could not, that as long as a sufficiently open and sophisticated third country was willing to keep the channels flowing, the pressure would never fully land. That debate has now been settled, not by Washington, not by Brussels, not by a new round of United Nations resolutions. It was settled by the regime itself the moment it decided to launch 438 ballistic missiles at the country that was keeping it alive. The city was never just a trading partner. It was the pressure valve, the workaround that made sanctions feel survivable. It was the one system that gave the regime room to breathe when every other door was closing, and the regime chose to bomb it. That decision will be studied for decades as one of the most consequential acts of geopolitical self-sabotage in modern history. In trying to send a message to the world about its military reach and its willingness to escalate, the regime did something no Western government had managed to do in 45 years. It severed its own lifeline. And the squeeze that follows is not just about frozen bank accounts and closed offices. It shows up in disrupted supply chains, in hospitals without medicine, in factories without parts, in families without schools, in a diaspora community of hundreds of thousands watching their second home disappear around them. All of it traces back to that one decision that changed everything on February 28, 2026. The story is not over. The situation continues to evolve rapidly, and we will be tracking every development. But the arc of this story is now clear. The city was the last real economic oxygen supply, and the regime, in a move that defied all strategic logic, turned off its own oxygen. That is why what is happening right now matters.